The morning wind blew cold through the nearly deserted streets of Willow Creek, the small town that only seemed to truly wake up after 7. It was exactly 6 o'clock when waitress Corinne Hale turned the rusty key in the back door of the Maple Diner, the corner restaurant that had become like a second home to her. She carried a bag with a clean apron, her hair tied up carelessly, and the certainty of yet another long day of strong coffee, rushed orders, and tables to clean. But before she could push open the metal door, a muffled sound made her stop. A low groan, almost a sigh of pain, coming from the narrow alley behind the diner. The waitress pressed the bag against her chest and took a cautious step forward. That was when she saw him, a man collapsed beside a stack of cardboard boxes dampened by the night's frost. The sight made her catch her breath. He didn't look like a homeless man. His dark coat, though dirty and torn at one shoulder, was made of fine, expensive fabric. His shoes, worn from dust, still betrayed someone accustomed to another kind of life. His face was lined with fatigue and cold, and a small open wound cut across the skin just above his eyebrow. "Sir?" she murmured, hesitant. "Can you hear me?" He opened his eyes slowly. Gray, intense eyes that studied her as if calculating every move. He tried to lift himself but groaned in pain, clutching his leg. "No, don't call anyone," he said, his voice hoarse, almost commanding. "Not the police. Not the hospital." Corinne felt her heart race. That request, coming from an injured man, sounded strange, wrong. "You need help," she insisted, kneeling beside him. "You're hurt, you may have broken something." "It was just a car," he cut in, breathing heavily. "A hit and run. But I'll be fine. I just need a place to rest." The young waitress's instinct screamed that something was wrong. But the other instinct, the one that had always spoken louder in her life, was compassion. She remembered her father, who used to say, "Daughter, when someone falls in front of you, you don't ask who they are, you reach out your hand." And that's what she did. With effort, she helped him lean on her shoulder and brought him inside the diner. The kitchen was still cold and silent, smelling of iron and soap. Corinne sat him in one of the steel chairs near the sink. She grabbed a clean towel, improvised a bandage for the cut on his forehead, and heated water to make coffee. "Drink this," she said, placing the mug in front of him. "It'll warm you up." The man gripped the cup with steady but shivering hands. He took a sip and closed his eyes for a moment, as if the bitter taste itself gave him back a piece of life. "What's your name?" Corinne ventured. "Cashin," he replied after a few seconds, offering nothing more. His silence made her uneasy. Rather than push him, she guided him to the small back room, the cleaning supply closet where she kept brooms, products, and a few boxes. It was cramped but had a small window that let in fresh air. "You can stay here for now," she said, arranging a blanket she found draped over a chair. "I'll open the diner soon. If you need anything, call me." The wounded man nodded, his gaze carrying something she couldn't quite decipher, gratitude, perhaps? Or simply caution. Moments later, the bell above the main door announced the first customer. The Maple Diner came to life, the smell of bacon sizzling on the grill, fresh coffee brewing, and the lazy conversations of truckers stopping early on the road. The waitress tied her apron, forced a smile, and began her shift. But with every order, with every tray she carried, she couldn't get the mysterious man out of her mind. What kind of person, injured like that, would refuse to go to a hospital? Then, in the middle of the morning, two men at the counter spoke in hushed voices. "Did you hear? 2 inmates escaped from the penitentiary. The town's on alert. They say they're dangerous." Corinne let the cup slip for a second in her hand before setting it down in front of the customer. Her blood froze in her veins. Her eyes turned instinctively toward the back door. Could he be one of them? Her heart pounded, but she disguised it, continuing her service as if nothing had happened. Inside, however, doubt gnawed at her. When the rush finally eased and she could breathe a little, she headed for the small back room. She opened the door slowly. The man was sitting on the chair, his gaze distant, as if lost in thoughts too far away to reach. At the creak of the door, he raised his eyes to her. For a moment, silence weighed heavily. Corinne opened her mouth to speak, but he cut her off with a quiet, firm sentence, almost like a vow. "Trust me. I'm not who you think." And in that fraction of a second, the air seemed heavier, as if the entire diner had stopped to listen. The waitress closed the door slowly, her heart still racing from the intensity of his gaze. Outside, sirens echoed through the town, announcing that something serious had happened. She took a deep breath, trying to convince herself that this stranger was no threat. But deep down, an uneasy doubt wouldn't let her rest. Who, really, was the man she was now hiding inside the diner? If it were you, would you have trusted him or called the police? Write it in the comments. The waitress returned to the counter with quick steps, trying to act as though nothing had happened. The doorbell jingled again, bringing in an elderly couple who always ordered scrambled eggs with toast. She smiled, took their order, poured the coffee, but inside, her mind kept repeating the phrase that mysterious man had spoken. "Trust me. I'm not who you think." It was a short phrase, but full of enigmas. Who did she think he was? A fugitive? A beggar? A man in distress? Why did he seem to be hiding from the whole world? The diner's chatter grew as more customers arrived. Truckers, local workers, late students. Each brought their own stories and worries. But Corinne could only hear the whispered words at the counter, the prisoner's escape, patrols on the roads, the fear spreading through town. Suddenly, the distant wail of sirens echoed through the streets. Her heart leapt. She didn't know if it was coincidence, but it felt like a sign of danger. Corinne drew in a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She grabbed the coffee pot and went from table to table, refilling cups, smiling automatically, though each gesture felt mechanical. With every customer's glance, she wondered, what if someone finds out there's a stranger hidden in the back? What if he really is dangerous? When she finally had a minute to rest, she leaned against the counter. Her gaze drifted to the window, where she watched the frost-covered street. Willow Creek looked the same as ever, quiet, small, predictable. But inside her, nothing was in its place anymore. Her eyes fell on a framed photo behind the register, a picture from years ago. Her younger self, smiling carefree, beside her mother and younger brother. Her father wasn't there. He had died young, leaving behind bills, debts, and a void Corinne had never been able to fill. Life's hardships had taught her to carry responsibilities far too soon. She remembered the dawn spent working double shifts, the nights when dinner was just thin soup. Even so, she had always found the strength to keep going. Maybe it was that part of her that wouldn't let her abandon the wounded man to his fate. With a sigh, she walked into the kitchen, pretending to tidy pans, but in truth her steps carried her closer to the door of the back room. Her hand paused on the doorknob. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she turned it slowly and opened a crack. Cashin lay on the small makeshift bed of boxes and blankets. His eyes were closed, but he wasn't asleep. He breathed deeply, as if fighting against the pain. His forehead was still marked by the cut, his skin pale. Beside him sat the empty coffee mug. Corinne stood watching for a few seconds. He didn't have the face of a criminal. There was something in the way he held himself, as if constantly on guard, that resembled someone trained rather than lost. A soldier? An executive? A hunted man? He opened his eyes suddenly and looked straight at her. There was no surprise, only vigilance. "Do you need anything?" she asked, trying to mask her nervousness. Cashin shook his head. "Just time." The answer was vague, almost frustrating. But there was something in the firmness of his voice that kept her from pressing further. Corinne returned to the dining area, trying to push the doubts away, but each passing minute grew heavier. The radio in the kitchen released an update: police are intensifying the search for the two escapees. Residents are advised to keep doors locked and report any suspicious activity. She switched it off, her stomach twisting. She was about to sit down when a customer started a conversation. "Corinne, did you hear?" said Mrs. Henderson, stirring sugar into her coffee. "They say one of them is hurt." Corinne's blood froze. She forced a smile, feigning disinterest. "Is that so?" she murmured. "I hope the police handle it quickly." The talk moved on, but those words kept hammering in her mind. Hurt. That was exactly the state of the man hidden in the back. The rest of the shift dragged slowly, as if time itself were crawling. Between orders of pancakes and burgers, her thoughts always returned to the man concealed in the little room. What should she do? Report him? Throw him out? Or trust that enigmatic phrase he had spoken? By late afternoon, when the rush had slowed, she allowed herself another look. She found Cashin sitting, his arm resting on his injured leg. He was sweaty, exhausted, but there was a determined look on his face. When he noticed her, he tried to stand but staggered. "Don't push yourself," she said, instinctively reaching out. "You'll only make your leg worse." Cashin let out a short, humorless laugh. "I can't stay still for too long." "Then tell me why," Corinne shot back, unable to contain her urgency. "What happened to you?" He hesitated. His gray eyes scanned her face as though measuring how much he could reveal. At last, he answered, evasively. "I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time." Corinne sighed. That explained nothing. But strangely, she believed him. Before she could say more, the sound of cars outside made her flinch. Red and blue lights flickered briefly through the diner's window. A patrol passing by. Her heart raced. She shut the backroom door too quickly, leaning against it as she tried to catch her breath. The dilemma was heavier than she could bear. If he was innocent, abandoning him would be cruel. But if he was guilty, she was putting herself at risk and could even be accused of being an accomplice. Corinne closed her eyes for a moment, thinking of her elderly mother who depended on her teenage brother still living at home, the bills stacked on the kitchen table. She couldn't afford to risk everything. And yet, here she was, hiding a wounded stranger whose only request had been, "Don't call anyone." When she returned to the counter, the last customers were already leaving. The bell above the door chimed one final time that night. Silence settled over the diner, heavy and uncomfortable. Corinne gathered plates, wiped down tables, slipped the tip money into her pocket. But the thought wouldn't leave her. Who was that mysterious man? And why, when he looked at her, did his eyes say more than words ever could? That night, as she locked the doors of the Maple Diner, Corinne knew she had crossed an invisible line. Hiding that man could change everything, her routine, her safety, perhaps even her life. But she had no idea just how much. The next morning broke gray, with heavy clouds covering the sky over Willow Creek. Corinne Hale walked toward the Maple Diner faster than usual, the cold biting her face and anxiety tightening her chest. At every corner, she glanced over her shoulder, as if carrying a secret no one should ever know. She had spent the night wide awake, thinking about Cashin. Who was that man? A dangerous fugitive or an innocent cornered? What had really happened for him to end up wounded at the back of her diner? Too many questions and not a single answer. When she turned the key and pushed open the back door, her heart raced. The supply closet was silent, as always, but something felt different. She pushed the door carefully and switched on the light. The blanket she had left the night before was folded almost meticulously, resting on the chair. The empty mug was gone. The boxes were in the same place, but the space was empty. The injured man had vanished. Corinne took 2 steps inside, looking around, as if he might still be hiding in some corner. But there was no sign of him. No clothes, no muddy footprints, nothing. Only absence. "It can't be," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. She spent the rest of her shift restless, serving coffee and pancakes, but always with her eyes drifting toward the back door, waiting for him to limp back in, asking for more time. But the hours dragged on, and the silence grew only more cruel. When she closed the diner that afternoon, instead of heading straight home, Corinne walked to the newsstand on the corner. She bought the local paper and flipped through the pages in a rush. Nothing. No news about an injured man, no missing person described as Cashin. Only reports about the fugitives and increased police patrols in the area. That night, she turned on the old radio in her kitchen. The static filled the air until the announcer's voice came through. Police continue searching for the two fugitives. Residents should remain on alert, and nothing more. No mention of a hit and run, of an injured man, of a mysterious stranger. The next day, while serving coffee to a few regulars, she dared to bring it up. "Have you heard of anyone injured around here?" she asked casually, as if it were nothing more than curiosity. Mr. Miller, who always ordered eggs with bacon, frowned. "No, Corinne. All they talk about are the fugitives. But if there were someone injured wandering the town, the police would already know." Another customer nodded in agreement. "Nobody gets away around here. Willow Creek is too small." Corinne smiled mechanically, but inside, a knot tightened. Cashin had disappeared as if he had never existed. No trace, no clue. The following days were a blur of routine and obsession. Corinne served customers, wiped tables, poured coffee, but each action was mechanical, as if she lived in the background. Her mind was always on the empty little room. At night, lying in the narrow bed of her small apartment, sleep refused to come. She thought of his gray eyes, of the grave tone when he had said, "Trust me. I'm not who you think." It was impossible to forget. She began to wonder if she had imagined it all. Maybe she was exhausted, overworked, caught in a fleeting fantasy. But then she remembered the cut on his forehead, the smell of blood mingled with coffee, the weight of his body as she helped him into the diner. That had been real. And if he was a criminal, why was there no trace of him in the news? If he was innocent, why hadn't he trusted her enough to tell the truth? The questions piled up like dirty dishes in an abandoned kitchen sink. On the third night after his disappearance, Corinne decided to clean the back room once and for all. She grabbed a bucket, a rag, and stepped into the silent space. The smell of cleaning supplies and dust filled the air. As she moved one of the boxes to sweep underneath, something caught her eye, a small folded piece of paper wedged between the box and the wall. Her heart raced. She picked up the note with trembling hands. The paper was crumpled, smudged with dust, but the handwriting was steady, written in haste. "Thank you. One day I'll find a way to repay you." Corinne pressed a hand to her chest, her breath faltering. Cashin had left a mark. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't delirium. He had truly been there, and, somehow, he wanted her to know this wasn't the end. She stood frozen, holding the note as if it were precious evidence of a secret no one else shared. The doubts hadn't disappeared, but a different flame had been lit in her chest, hope. In the days that followed, Corinne carried the folded note inside the pocket of her apron. She hadn't shown it to anyone. Not to her mother, not to her brother, not even to the closest customers. It was as if that piece of paper were a silent pact between her and the mysterious man. But every time her fingers touched the paper, one question echoed, repay how? The silence in town only deepened the mystery. No one spoke of him. There were no clues. Only emptiness. And Corinne began to realize her life would never be the same again. That night, as she left the diner and walked through the deserted streets, Corinne pressed the note in her pocket. The cold wind lifted her hair, and the city lights flickered in the distance. She didn't know if Cashin was alive, if he was near, or if he had already crossed borders she could never imagine. But one certainty stayed with her, somehow, their fates were tied. And sooner or later, he would return. The following days dragged on for Corinne like a silent march. The diner was the same as ever, the sizzle of the griddle, the smell of bacon and coffee, the usual laughter of the regular customers. But inside, nothing was the same. Since Cashin's disappearance, every morning carried a strange expectation, as if at any moment he might walk through the door. The note was still in her apron pocket. Sometimes, during quiet moments, she would run her fingers over the crumpled paper and mentally reread those few words, "Thank you. One day I'll find a way to repay you." It was a promise, but promises in her life had always been as fragile as glass. She tried not to believe too much, to avoid disappointment. Even so, every time the door opened, part of her expected to see him. And every time he didn't appear, a pang of emptiness consumed her. That Tuesday morning, business was slow. The clock struck 9, and Corinne took the chance to clean the counter when the Maple Diner's door swung open. The bell jingled, and she lifted her eyes, expecting just another ordinary customer. The man who entered, however, was anything but ordinary. He wore a dark, immaculate suit, tailored with almost sullen precision. His brown hair, once disheveled and matted with dust, was now neatly combed. His skin, once pale and marked with exhaustion, carried a healthy tone. He walked with the confidence of someone used to being observed, someone who knew exactly the weight behind every gesture. It took Corinne a moment to recognize him. But then the eyes, those same gray, intense eyes, cut through her just as they had the first time. Her heart raced. Cashin was back. She nearly dropped the cloth she was holding. She tried to hide it, but her hand trembled. He approached the counter calmly and sat on one of the high stools, as if he had all the time in the world. "A coffee, please," he said, his voice steady and composed. Corinne swallowed hard. She served the drink as she did every day, but every movement felt different, charged with something invisible. She set the cup in front of him, and when she tried to avoid his eyes, it was impossible. Cashin was smiling. A discreet smile, but unmistakable. It was as if he were saying, without words, "I'm back. I kept my promise." 1,000 questions burst inside her, but none made it to her lips. Where had he been? Who was he, really? How had he transformed so quickly? His face was clean, his clothes impeccable, his posture flawless. It was impossible to reconcile this figure with the wounded, vulnerable man she had found in the alley. She almost let out a nervous laugh. This all felt like a movie scene. But there was nothing fictional about the intensity of the way he looked at her. It was real, tangible. "So, she tried to begin, but her voice failed. Cashin lifted his gaze, still with that contained smile. There was something different about him now, not just his appearance. It was his posture, his confidence, the way he seemed to occupy the space. He was no longer the broken man she had found collapsed in the alley. He was someone accustomed to leading, to commanding, to being obeyed. Corinne gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. A mixture of relief and suspicion washed over her. Part of her wanted to smile, to embrace him, to ask if he was all right. Another part wanted to shout, to demand answers, to accuse him of leaving her in agony. The smell of fresh coffee rose between them, dense, as if time itself had slowed just to stretch that reunion. Before she could finish her sentence, the diner door opened again. The bell rang louder this time, as if announcing something greater. 2 men walked in. They weren't ordinary customers. Dressed in dark suits, carrying leather briefcases, they brought with them a seriousness that filled the room with tension. Their steps were firm, calculated, echoing across the tiled floor. Corinne noticed even the regular customers glanced sideways in silence, as if the presence of those men had turned the air heavier. One of them lifted his eyes and spoke clearly. "Corinne Hale?" The entire diner seemed to freeze. Some customers turned their heads, curious. Old Mr. Miller stopped halfway through a sip of coffee. Even the sizzle from the griddle seemed to fade for a moment. Corinne stood paralyzed, the tray still in her hands. She looked at Cashin, who remained seated, calm, as though he had been expecting this. Her heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe. Who were these men? What did they want with her? Cashin kept his gaze fixed on her, his gray eyes gleaming with something enigmatic. He said nothing. He simply waited, as if he knew this moment had been inevitable. The silence was suffocating. Corinne's future felt suspended on an invisible thread, ready to snap. She felt the ground vanish beneath her feet. Her difficult past, her doubts about this man, everything seemed to converge in that instant. What did those men want? And most of all, why was Cashin looking at her with such calm, as if he already knew exactly what was about to happen? The silence inside the diner was nearly unbearable. Corinne Hale remained motionless, staring at the two suited men who had just entered. Her name hung in the air like a sentence. Corinne Hale? She nodded slowly, unable to hide the tremor in her hands. Mr. Miller cleared his throat, trying to mask the discomfort, but all eyes were on her. Yes, that's me, she answered, her voice unsteady. The men exchanged a brief glance and then approached, pulling documents from their leather cases. But before they could say a word, Cashin Ward rose from his seat at the counter. The movement was calm, but heavy with authority. He no longer seemed like the wounded man she had once hidden in the supply closet. His presence filled the space, commanding, as if he had been born to take control of moments like this. It's all right, Cashin said firmly, looking at Corinne. They're here at my request. She blinked, stunned. At your request? She murmured. Cashin, what's going on? One of the suited men gave a slight bow toward him. Mr. Ward, the documents are ready. Corinne's confusion deepened. Mr. Ward? Why were they addressing this man with such formality? Cashin turned back to her. His gray eyes seemed softer now, though they still carried the intensity that always unsettled her. Corinne, there are many things I couldn't tell you, he began. Not that night, not when you found me injured. If I had told you the truth, I would have put you in danger. Her breath caught. Then, who are you? Cashin took a deep breath before answering. I'm not a criminal. Far from a fugitive. I'm a target. He let the words fall heavy in the air. For weeks now, people have been trying to destroy me. They staged an attack against me, against my company, against everything I'd built. Corinne gripped the counter, trying to absorb his words. You're a businessman? She asked hesitantly. He nodded. Not just a businessman. I am Cashin Ward. He paused, as if expecting the name itself to carry weight. CEO of the Ward Group. Corinne felt the world tilt. Of course she had heard that name on the radio, in the papers, in passing conversations from customers about business. One of the most powerful conglomerates in the country. But she never could have imagined that the man she found dirty, wounded, and hiding in an alley was the very same man who commanded empires. I was on a nearby road, trying to escape, Cashin continued. There was an attack. The car was hit, and I had to run. I couldn't go to the police. If I had checked into a hospital, my enemies would have known exactly where to find me. That's how you found me, vulnerable, exposed, closer to death than I had ever been. Corinne felt her eyes burn. The memory of that morning came back vividly, the cut on his forehead, the cold, the desperate way he had begged her not to call anyone. Now it all made sense. You saved me, Corinne, Cashin said, taking a step toward her. Not just by cleaning my wound or giving me coffee. You gave me something that no private security, no money, no influence could have given me in that moment, time. Time to breathe. To wait. To survive. She swallowed hard, her heart racing. I didn't do anything special, she murmured. Cashin smiled, but there was seriousness in his eyes. You did everything. Anyone else could have exposed me, betrayed me, abandoned me. But you chose to care. And that's why I'm here. To fulfill my promise. He gave a signal, and the men in suits opened their briefcases. Corinne saw documents, contracts, embossed papers. One of them placed a stack on the counter before her. "What is this?" she asked, confused. "The Maple Diner," Cashin replied. "It's yours now." Corinne took a step back. "What?" "I bought the building." The diner was about to be taken over by investors who only see numbers. "Now it belongs to you. The business, the space, everything." Not as charity, he emphasized, his voice filled with conviction. "But as recognition. Because you reached out your hand without knowing who I was." Tears finally escaped Corinne's eyes. She shook her head, unable to believe. "I can't accept this." Cashin stepped closer, his voice low, firm. "This isn't alms, Corinne. It's justice. You saved me when you didn't have to. Now I want to ensure that you and your family never again have to choose between surviving and living." Those words struck her like a blow. Years of struggle, of long shifts, of stacked bills, of sleepless nights. And now, in front of her, someone was offering not just money, but the chance at a different future. She looked at him, searching for some lie, some trace of arrogance. But all she found was sincerity. Cashin carefully took her hand. "Don't think of this as a debt. Think of it as destiny. Our paths crossed for a reason." Corinne didn't reply. She simply let the tears fall in silence, feeling that, for the first time in a long while, the weight on her shoulders felt lighter. The Maple Diner looked different. The walls were painted, the lights replaced, and a new glow illuminated every detail. But what had truly changed was the atmosphere. Corinne walked through the dining room with a genuine smile, greeting customers, serving tables, but now with the certainty that the place was hers. From the counter, Cashin watched in silence, drinking coffee as he did every morning. He didn't come as a powerful businessman, but as a man who had found something real in a small town. Corinne knew her life would never be the same again. Not because she now owned a restaurant, but because she had learned that kindness, even the simplest kind, can transform destinies that once seemed too far to reach. That morning, in the scent of fresh coffee and the echo of a secret, Corinne understood that even the smallest gestures can build bridges between distant fates. Do you believe kindness can truly change someone's destiny? Write yes in the comments.